Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Professor Faisal Devji discusses the complex geopolitical relationship between America and India and what it could mean for Chinese diplomacy.
So we've recently seen that the Biden administration has rolled out the red carpet for India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And many were left asking why they had to go to this extent to do so for someone who is widely considered an authoritarian, whose government is seen as tolerating and indeed inciting violence, and which has not taken a particularly pro-Western line on Ukraine and on Russia, therefore. Now, most of the accounts that seek to explain what happened in DC have to do with either castigating Biden for betraying democracy, or in a kind of hyper-admiring way of recognizing the necessity of a realpolitik with India. India is a big country. The United States needs to contain China. India, of course, is China's biggest victim in some ways, and certainly its biggest enemy, and therefore you need India. But neither of these explanations really makes much sense to me, because it seems to me that India needs the United States far more than the US needs India. India is a weak reed in many ways. It really cannot be used militarily against China, in part because the US vision of military activity in containing China is maritime. It has to do with the South China Sea and this kind of thing. Whereas India, of course, shares a 1,000-kilometer border with China, across which there have been many incursions already, and there continue to be armed incursions with people killed. And the Chinese, I don't think, really need or want Indian territory. Their incursions are meant simply to warn India not to go any further in its alliance making with Western countries. That India is uniquely vulnerable, and it can be put in its place very quickly by the Chinese. So India's military focus is on its vulnerability, which is the Himalayan region. It has no business sending its navy out to the South China Sea. And it also knows that the US is unlikely to send troops or even arms sufficient to deter a Chinese attack. So the military angle makes no sense at all. Though, of course, what it does do is symbolically strip India as a very big country away from the apparently unanimous picture of a global South that stands against certainly the war in Ukraine, the Western war in Ukraine, or the Western support of the Ukrainians in that war. But that hardly justifies red carpet treatment in Washington, D.C. When you look at the deals made, most of them seem to be economic, and of course there's some military as well, because there's an effort to shift India away from its reliance on Russian weapons to American ones. But again, not a sufficient reason for this kind of treatment of Modi. What the deals do tell us, however, is that what is happening in India, at least from the American point of view, is that it needs to be upgraded to be not a military ally, but to be, if you will, the second and a more controllable China for the United States. It's the only country of its kind, with its size, its scale, its cheap labor, its plentiful labor, and its skills, especially in high tech, to replace China as eventually a producer of cheap goods for the world, a resource of cheap labor, which is what it has always been since colonial times, and increasingly a market in its own right for Western goods. These are all roles that China had played not so long in the past. China now is proving to be a threat politically and possibly even militarily. What you need is a defanged China, and India fits the bill perfectly, it seems to me. But of course it's going to take time, because India simply does not have the capacity to do any of this at the moment. And that is why American help is needed. So if we are looking at a long-term project, this is the end it envisages. It envisages an end which is not political, which is explicitly not political, but which is economic. in nature. In other words, whereas we've been talking for a long time now about the development of a multipolar global order, a multipolar political order in which India would rightfully take its place, what the Biden administration seems to be thinking about is not a multipolar political order, but a multipolar economic order in which India takes its place as an economic partner of the kind I described, the second China, except a depoliticized China. Now, whether these gestures on the part of the United States are meant simply to serve as a signal to the Chinese to behave themselves and stay within certain red lines, or whether there really is a project, but necessarily a long-term one, I don't know. But it seems to me that the upshot of it is that rather than imagining that the United States is on an entirely new economic mission, they're going to do reshoring and the Green New Deal and everything is going to change. In fact, what we are seeing is an expansion of the same old economic logic, which is, no, whatever we do with the Green New Deal, what we want is we are going to go back to globalization, but it's going to be a bifurcated one. We need another China, it's going to be India, but it's going to be depoliticized purely in economic terms, and we shall continue to our cheap goods, our low interest rates, should we return to them, and a big market to which we can sell our goods, and that is the nature of our partnership. In this sense, China's presence and the threat it poses to India especially actually works for the United States. Indeed, the United States should work to increase the threat perception there, because its fear would be India joining with China in some other kind of enterprise which would really create a multipolar order. This, of course, cannot be allowed to happen. So India needs to diversify and turn towards the United States especially, and the West more generally. Its elite is already highly westernized in any case. And in order for this to work, you need a threatening China on India's borders. That keeps India in its place as an economic rather than political rival, indeed not even a rival economically, but a market. And it prevents it from having any kind of new relationship with India, which is something Prime Minister Modi actually began his prime ministership by trying to do. It didn't work, and I suppose the American gamble is it won't work in future, and we shall do everything we can to prevent it from working.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.